Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Ooh, we hate that word, wretch. The Unity hymnal changes the word to soul, and it is far from the only hymnal that removes it. We don't like the word fear either, as in, 'twas grace that taught my heart to fear. I get it, I do. I once was totally behind it, especially the fear word. I never could get completely behind the God-fearing philosophy. Loves and protects me, and I'm afraid don't sit well with me in concert. Add to that, I just don't believe that God desires our fear. And that word wretch, I mean, right there where it is in the sentence, a wretch like me. If I sing this song, am I saying that I think I'm a wretch? I don't think I'm a wretch. I don't want to think of the people standing next to me singing this song as wretches. We're humans, subject to human frailty and failure, sure. But wretches? Like most people, I knew all the words to the song, and I loved it, and I sang it often. Yet I never really listened to the words, thought about the words, thought about, well, what was the song actually about? But in 2006, a mainstream production movie came out about John Newton, the man who wrote the lyrics to Amazing Grace. The trailers for the movie said that the man was the captain of a slave ship until the grace of God opened his eyes. The very idea that a man that had captained slave ships could write a song like that, it surprised me, shocked me even. I mean, the captain of a ship engaged in the Atlantic trade of African slaves. Now, to start with, I'm one of those people who think that slavery is the single most horrible institution ever devised by humans. People talk of the shame of being a slave. Shame for being a slave? Horror being a slave. Sorrow and pain and loss and helplessness and hopelessness. That's being a slave. But shame? Shame is to own a slave. What blot on any soul could be more dark and more deep than just believing you actually own another person? And the transport of slaves, in all times and in all places, the transport of slaves, especially newly captured slaves, has always been particularly brutal and heart-wrenching. And of all the records and the writings and the understandings we have of the brutal transport of slaves through the ages, probably the very most horrible, the most dehumanizing, the most mind-bendingly shocking in its application as an institution was the transport of African slaves across the Atlantic in the 1700s. I won't go into descriptions of the slaveholds, but I will note that during the 8 to 16-week trip, the tightly packed ships had a death rate that often exceeded 30%, sometimes up to half. So all this spinning in my mind, I went and I read his story. And then I sang the song again. And I cried. I realized in a flash what the song was about. It's about redemption. Not any old redemption, certainly not the redemption of Mother Teresa, not the redemption of the good wife who sacrifices herself for her family and her children, not the redemption of the coal miner who spends all night in the coal mine and all day in the fields to keep shoes on his kids' feet. Not redemption for the sin of taking an extra rib at the potluck or not sending a thank you letter to grandma. We don't like that word wretch there in that beautiful song because these are the kinds of sins that are in our life and that we easily forgive. Not the sins of wretches. Because the reality is, we're not so sure about those wretches. I mean, someone really and truly wretched. We kind of don't want to actually think that God forgives and brings home those evil people who do the kinds of things that make news stories that we try to hide from our kids. Some of us are not so sure about contemplating redemption and a place in my heaven for those terrible people who will vote for Trump or who want to enshrine abortion rights into a state constitution. There are very few people in the modern world who would not consider someone who captained a slave ship a wretch. I mean, we can come around to God forgiving someone for advocating that pumping crude should be illegal or that homelessness should be. But this, it brings home what we mean by truly bad. That word, wretch, gives so much more power to that song. We're not talking about no downstream redemption, no easy lift. How far does God's grace go? When Jesus died on the cross, we were all redeemed. Redeemed, by the way, redeemed, by the way, means to buy back that which is sold or lost. When Jesus died, the price of our souls, all of our souls, was paid in blood. And when Jesus rose and walked out of that tomb, we knew that it was actually so. What does that mean? It means that John Newton could be saved. It meant that the grace of God could fill his heart, open his eyes, bring him to understand who he was and what he did. And then it could fill his heart with love and acceptance and forgiveness. We might wonder, why do I really care about that? Horrible things like this man did are things I read about in history or in the news, not things of my life. Why would I want to taint such a beautiful song with the understanding that even a wretch like John Newton could be saved? After all, I may not be perfect, but I'm not that bad. Am I? Don't we all have a tendency to judge ourselves harshly for our failures? No matter how many Easters we celebrate, do we not still wonder on some dark and sorrowful days if maybe our sins are more than God will forgive? Do we not fear on some days that God does not love us? Oh, that word fear. You see, after I read about the life of John Newton, I realized that he was not saying in this song that grace had taught his heart to fear God, but that God had put John in a situation so dire, so dangerous, that he became so fearful that, atheist though he thought he was, he cried out to God to save him. And in a flash, he realized that he did believe in God. Made him realize that God's love was there for him. Made him see the realities of how he was living his life. He felt fear because he suddenly realized he wanted God's love. But perhaps God couldn't love someone like him. But God did love him. And we, in our fears that God can't love us, no matter how irrational those fears may be, we can look at John Newton and know if God could forgive and redeem that man, then God will forgive me too, even on my very worst day. This is important because we don't actually know how bad our worst day might be. No matter how strongly I may believe differently, I don't know what the future holds or what sins I might end up committing. There's a prayer, a shortened version of Proverbs 37 through 9. God, give me not poverty, lest I steal. A specific example of the concept of not to judge a man until you've walked a day in his moccasins. I contend that we don't know. We don't know, for instance, how far we can go with our ability to not see something as bad because that badness interferes with our goals. I mean, how did John Newton cope with the suffering of humans under his care, at a level that would have likely made him angrily chastise the ship owners if it had been horses in his hold? And we don't know how we will react to certain levels of fear, anger, and despair. We all think we know ourselves, but we only actually know how we hope we will react, not necessarily how we will. When I was in college, I spent some time as a volunteer in a battered woman's shelter. I would see the women come in, battered and bruised and terrified, clutching a couple of equally terrified kids, and they would be shuffled off to a safe house. And a month later, I would hear that they were back with the man. And another month, there they were at the door, clutching the same frightened kids, sporting a whole new set of bruises. And I said, I was so self-righteous. I was so sure when I said, that would never be me. Okay, it's true, he never hit me, although I think it would have gotten there. Almost 20 years later, it was me. And the only reason I left that man was because he threw me out. I was beaten down so low that I couldn't change lanes on the freeway if I could see another car. When, after it was over, I had a long talk with an old friend about the realities of my life the previous several years. He said, I would have thought someone treated you like that, you would rip off their head and spit down their neck. Yeah, I kind of thought that too. There, but by the grace of God. In 2013, an illusionist named Darren Brown aired a reality show called The Push. The basic plot was that through staged events and carefully scripted manipulation, the crew tried to convince an individual to push a person off a roof. While no one will say how many people were sent through the process or how many did or did not choose to push, from what was aired, we know that at least 3 people did push. No one was actually hurt, by the way, except probably the people who pushed and woke up in the middle of the night for the rest of their life thinking about what they had decided to do. And maybe we won't even get to decide. What about just a moment of carelessness or bad luck with horrible results? Read about that in the news any day you look. When I lived in a little town on the Russian River called Monterrey, there was an old metal bridge across the river. The kids would drop something off the bridge on the upstream side and then dash across the bridge to watch it come out underneath. Unfortunately, the way the bridge was constructed, you couldn't see the kids on the rail until they dashed out. Well, one day traffic was stopped going across the bridge. The fireman holding the traffic said 2 young kids had dashed out right in front of a loaded contractor's truck and both been struck dead. They needed an ambulance for the contractor. He wasn't hurt, just from the horror of what he had done, even though there was no way he could have stopped. What am I getting here? That any one of us could have been, or still could be, John Newton. There, but by the grace of God go I. Sure, this is a level of redemption not common, and it is highly unlikely that anyone here will need redemption like that. But it makes a difference to know if your human self commits something horrible, that your soul can still be redeemed. My sister's first husband was a volunteer firefighter. One night he got called out to a car wreck. There were two teenage sisters. The car and the girls were both totally mangled. They put each girl on a separate helicopter and flew them to separate hospitals. So they each had all the resources available. That's a lot of resources to spend on one family. All the emergency personnel and the trucks and the helicopters and the hospital space and the medical personnel, just to save the lives and hopefully limbs of two people. But I doubt anyone in that community would have said it shouldn't have been spent that way, and I'll pay the taxes for it too. Because if it had been their kid, their mother, their brother, or their own self there on that road, they want to know that helicopter's there for them too. Myself, I am very grateful that John Newton could be redeemed. Because should my human self ever fall, and life causes me to do something that I never thought I would do and never wanted to do, I know my soul is not lost. The price to redeem our souls was paid when Jesus died on the cross. And we celebrate his resurrection because when he walked out of that tomb, we knew the promise was true. Now I would like to do Amazing Grace. You have the words there as it was originally written by John Newton. There should be, I have 24 of them, so it should be able to.
Does anyone need another?
I muted it because I didn't think anyone wanted to hear me sing that loud. Something's on. Okay. Anyway, time for offerings. If we could have a couple of ushers.